Everyone. I'm Claire Lipschultz, an NCJW Vice President and State Policy Advocate Co-Coordinator. On a more local level, I'm the California State Policy Advocate and on the board of the Sacramento section. And I'm so excited to welcome you to our NCJW Webinars Leadership Series. NCJW has launched a uniquely tailored version of our webinar series, open exclusively to our leadership network and dedicated to creating an online space to connect, learn together, and provide leadership training and skills. We're excited to offer today's webinar on project development. And in the next hour, we'll go through the process of project visioning, research, design, and evaluation, providing resources each step of the way. And we're so glad that you are able to join us today. Before we get started, there's a few housekeeping notes I'd like to go over with you. You'll notice that everyone's mics are muted. This is to prevent background noise, dogs barking, husbands walking in the background. You're welcome to unmute during group discussions, and we'll let you know when it's time. Feel free to write questions down or drop them in the chat box as we go along, and we'll have time to review them at the end. Write in the chat if you're experiencing ongoing technical issues, but please do note our limited capacity to address issues while the webinar is running. Also note that we are recording the webinar and we will upload it to our website to share it with those who cannot attend in person. Please include your name, section, and title in your Zoom name. You've already been asked to do that. And when you speak during the interactive discussions today, we're going to ask you to please introduce yourself with these 3 pieces of information. And with that, it is my pleasure to introduce Renee Karp, who is currently the immediate past president of the National Council of Jewish Women Greater Dallas section. Renee was the program director at Temple Emmanuel, Dallas, where she worked for 33 years. During that time, she developed many programs addressing the multiple and changing needs of a large dynamic congregation. We're very pleased to welcome you, Renee, again, to lead us today in this important session. Please take it away.
All right. Good morning, everyone. It depends where you are, whether it's morning, afternoon. I'm hearing background noise, guys. Are we good? Okay, great. All right. Let me explain the process just a little bit for you, and I'm going to take you through how we made the decision and why we did it, particularly during my presidency. I was sitting at a board meeting when a new member brought up what she thought was a worthy project. She was a former school principal and was aware that in our city were homeless, pregnant teenage girls, and they were in desperate need of nutritional food. So that she discovered that one of the local school districts was looking for a partner to address this issue. She thought it was a great NCJW match. She brought it to a board meeting and it got voted down. And this was defeated for several reasons. It was certainly relational. She was new to the board, so there was no developed sense of trust, and there were too many questions about the project that she could not appropriately answer. I felt awful about this. The look on her face was so defeated, and I thought to myself, there has got to be a better way to do this kind of stuff, right? Up until this point, we would create an ad hoc R&D committee when the section was interested in adding a new project. And indeed, one of our most successful and continuing projects was through this ad hoc process. But what became apparently clear at that board meeting, that there was a change afoot and that we needed to address this, right? With the help of some very savvy, talented, visionary women, we created a permanent R&D standing committee. Now, when someone thinks there's a project that is a good fit for our section, it no longer matters who proposes it. It's a process. During our time together, I'm going to use a step-by-step approach from the creation of the R&D team, the established criteria used by the R&D team, through design, development, implementation phases to the development of evaluation criteria. If we could have the first slide, please. So part of what we did was all right, so I see I'm asking for technical advice here. How do I get rid of the sidebar, Samantha? Because I'm not seeing, I have the sidebar of everybody on there, but I need to reduce that.
Yes, there is, at the top of it, there should be like a grid of buttons, one
Yes,
dash.
I see the grid.
So if you click the one that looks like a dash and is hide thumbnail, the smallest one, it'll hide all of the thumbnails. And you should have
Thank
your
you,
whole
ma'am. Done. Thank you. This could have been interesting, right? So we went through strategic planning during this time, and we had decided that we needed to establish a standing research and development committee. That's the better way I referred to, right? And so we developed a set of criteria and an ongoing process to research and assess the development of new to develop a set of criteria, right, for new NCJW originated service projects. And that's primarily what we had been doing before. We added to this partnership by NCJW and existing service projects with community partners. So we're going to add a new project with a community partner, and we're in the process of that right now. And lastly, engagement in community-wide strategic partnerships that advance the mission goals and priorities of NCJW, stuff that we as a section have struggled with all the time. And they were to report their relevant findings and make recommendations to the NCJW Board of Directors based on their research and assessment. Next slide, please. All right, so this was an expanded, so you saw the initial job description, and Samantha and I talked about this piece a little bit. This was an expanded job description, and the reason for this was that we wanted to clarify roles and solidify the governance position of the chair of this position. For me and for so many of us, we see something and something that we've been doing as a board or as a section for a really long time. And then you ask the question, why are we doing that way? And nobody ever is able to answer it. So, so there was great wisdom in our executive committee in adding who the R&D committee fell under, the public affairs vice president. Now, as you look at this, two cautions here. One, this can change. In other words, we could decide, well, maybe it doesn't belong in public affairs, maybe it belongs in community service or vice versa. So that this is not necessarily concrete. It just tells us what the initial intent was, and that this position is important enough that the chair serve on the board of directors. That was very important to the executive committee. And it is the role of this chair to appoint a committee from the membership of NCJW, and that they would hold meetings on a regular basis. If we could go to the next slide, please. All right, so this is what we're going to do in the chat box, because while I am the talking head right now, what works for one section, we know, doesn't work for every section. So looking at the goals and description, which we just did, of an R&D committee, and if you are interested in creating that, can you describe what are the qualities, characteristics, or strengths that you might need to serve on your R&D committee? So this is the time for you guys to do the talking. And Samantha or Claire, is somebody going to be reading the chat box?
Yes, I can read the chat box out.
Okay, so I'm shutting up and you guys are doing the work.
So the first response is, from Sue Strait in Milwaukee. Good community knowledge, outreach, good knowledge of section and national priorities.
Absolutely. Great. 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 That's on my list. Right?
What else comes to mind when you think of this question?
Someone sent me a private note. I'll read it. Listen to new ideas, that they have new ideas, and that it's not the same people.
Great.
Qualities are knowledge of mission, creativity, community needs, flexibility, curiosity, all which are great.
Really great. Really great. All right, guys, I think we can move on, right? And if I can have the next slide, Lindsay. Okay, so this is what the R&D committee created for themselves, right? That they will be responsible for developing a set of criteria and project evaluation process. And this is how they were going to accomplish this. They were going to create a project submission form that solicits the data required for the evaluation of a project using the following process. So I want you to think of some of the responses in the chat box, right? Performing ongoing research in the community to determine the viability of new NCJW originated projects that align with the mission of NCJW and the local strategic priorities set by the NCJW Board of Directors to address an unmet need in the community. The unmet need is important, but I want you to see some of the responses that you gave in the chat box are really quite there. Someone who knew the community, someone who knew something about national and what local priorities are, and then evaluating the case for support for projects that are championed by NCJW members and presented to R&D for consideration. The next slide, please. And creating that solicits the data required for the evaluation of the project using the following process. Evaluating the case for support for requests for volunteers and or resources. Evaluating NCJW participation in community-based strategic partnerships, that was the second one, and collaborating with the advocacy committee to assure that the new initiatives are aligned with the advocacy goals of NCJW. That bullet point in particular, the collaboration with advocacy, was something that was newer for us, that we had decided as a section that we needed to combine all of this work. So, and that we balanced our advocacy, right, and our involvement in the community, and the two pieces matched. And that has been a really incredible criteria as we have moved forward. And that all recommendations of R&D for the adoption of new projects or development of new strategic partnerships must be submitted to the NCJW Board of Directors for approval. Next slide. Among this committee's responsibilities was the development of a set of criteria that would enable them to evaluate the viability of a new project. This is something that every one of us, I suspect, in one form or another on this phone call have done. What criteria do you think would be necessary to include when we are trying to figure out does this project work for you? Again, in the chat box, what should some of that criteria be?
So one response was reliability of the partner, criteria to measure success, community needs, emotionally connected.
Oh, nice.
Impact to the community, something not done by other organizations, group has estimate budget, staff history are questions, any cost, interest of NCJW members, what resources the section has available to put into the project, number of volunteers required, scope, cost per unit, criteria, evaluation, how to measure success, availability of national resources, financial and volunteers, results should be achievable, sustainability of the project.
Man, you guys are great. Right, because you've all done this before, right? And I'm reading still more, right?
So meet SMART goals, and national actually use SMARTY, which includes inclusivity and equitable goal pieces. Advance the goals of our section's mission.
I just saw how to avoid groupthink, right? And when we were looking at I can't begin to tell you how important that particular one is. And so particularly if we were to go all the way back to the slide where we looked at what are the criteria for putting people on an R&D committee, you know, and one of you mentioned it, it's someone that is willing to think out of the box, right? Are you going back there, Lindsay? Right. So take a look at that, you know, and clearly, if you want to accomplish all of that, this is the group that you've put together that needs to be able to do that, which is why I took the time to include this. In my way too many years, who the group that makes the decisions has to be as erudite and out of the box, which one of you mentioned. So that's really important when you see, that's, I think, again, I will respond by chat or Samantha will call it. I think that's an incredibly important thing that you know, if we all think alike, right, it would not be a very interesting world. And there are better aphorisms than that, guys. But all right, if we could go back to the slide, right, where we start, Lindsay, great. Okay, so this is being recorded, right, Samantha and Lindsay?
Yes.
Right. So, and the reason that I'm asking that question, because while I have, and when it's recorded, everybody gets all the chat stuff, right?
No, but we've called it out for that purpose.
Okay. All right. Because I thought the contributions that came on chat may not be in this submission form, and they were really wonderful. So I love them. All right. So if we could, so here's what this incredible group of women did. How does this project deliver on the mission? Does it fit within the priorities? And are we helping to create a new program, right? How do you know? All right, now we can go to the next slide, love. Right. How do you describe how the community needs this project? Again, you all address that beautifully. The scope and what's the gap to be addressed. Are there any similar projects or organizations already doing this in the community? And they added this: we want to know if your project is unique in the community and fills a gap in service, or alternatively, if there are many similar projects also helping to meet the same need. And if so, will your project still be important? And when I get someplace else, I'm going to show you how that one sort of played itself out. That's a great question, because sometimes someone else is doing it, but they're only meeting one piece of the population. So it doesn't mean there's room for more. And that's why that particular piece was added. Project goals and objectives and project evaluation plan. Lindsay, next slide, please, love. How is your project going to be managed? Who's going to lead the project? Volunteer hours and years in the position. What's the timeline? Is this going to take you a year to set it up? And if it's going to take that time, when do you think you will begin the project? You're going to need volunteers for this project. What are their responsibilities going to be? How are you going to recruit these volunteers? Do these volunteers need to be trained? What is what is the role, if any, of non-NCJW participants in the project not already identified above? Because often all of us go outside of our membership if we're looking for expertise, and we've done that on more than one occasion. And how do you raise awareness of the project within NCJW, the Jewish community, and the DFW community? I can tell you on a personal level from the Dallas section, E is the thing we probably do least well. The next slide, please. Right. How many volunteers, detailed budget, any other requests, marketing and publicity, outcome plans, and are there any ways that NCJW can support your efforts to successfully administer your program, right? And if we can go to the next slide, please. All right. All right. And you see that outcome measurement tool, how did they want to do that? Now, this was, you can tell that this was a very sophisticated group. And again, that caution, figure this out, you know, do this for yourself. We just gave away some COVID money and made a decision not to use this rubric because we didn't want to burden our COVID money recipients to have to do this too. So we abbreviated this form greatly. You guys know your section. While this worked for us, you know, make it your own. And the budget form was really important to us because this is where we found as a section that we do not think everything through enough. So we make sure, yes, it is, Toby, a very hard process. That's why I shared with you to ignore it, right? But the attachment of a budget, how much money are you going to need? How is it going to be spent? This is the piece that certainly can get our section into trouble. If we can go to the next slide, please. All right. So now this committee created this whole amazing set of criteria, right? They're up and running. And then they ran into, well, how were they going to evaluate? Was there a system for them in place to evaluate the projects? This was with this rubric was designed by the R&D committee for the R&D committee before they were going to make any recommendations. And they used a point system, again, something that we use all the time in trying to figure out how we are going to make something work, and we ask members. So everybody would receive all the recommendations, and this is the rubric that they use. So would you, the comments regarding, if you see number 1, the relevance to NCJW mission and priority, and comments regarding the proposal's alignment with NCJW mission and priority. The next slide, please. Please rate the proposal's description and summary. Include as much information as you can in order to facilitate the funding decision process. Again, this was for the committee members. So when they were looking at what was written, how did they evaluate that? If we could go to the next slide, please, and look at number 3. Please rate the proposal's measures of project effectiveness, right? And you will see, again, asking people not to just read it and say it looks good, but to really take the time to evaluate it. So is the evaluation plan unclear? Are they poorly described? Does it fit the project? Are things clearly stated and do things match? Next slide, please. Project management, right? And that's the timeline. Is this workable? I don't know for you all, but personally for me, every time you know, and I have certainly been guilty of this, we say, all right, we can get this done in 3 months, right? And then you can't, right, get it done in 3 months. So this is the time to sort of take a breath and to take a good look and say, let's really figure out how much time this will take. And the other cautionary piece, I think personally, here is we're a volunteer organization, right? And we are asking people to give us their time, from my perspective, for all of us that engage in this kind of work. Time is our most precious commodity, and we don't want to waste it. So I think we have to think really carefully about timing. Next slide, please. Budget, again, I mean, we as a section, I can't imagine that we all don't get into this. We have had some budget issues with a project, an NCJW originated project that is really going off base budget-wise, and we are trying to figure out, and so some members of the executive committee are going to be joining in a conversation next week. How do we sort of get everybody to pay attention to the budgeting process? We are stewards of NCJW. We're stewards of other people's money, right? So people join us, people give us grants, and how we use their money is incredibly important. I think the days of us saying, oh, just the people that know about budgets need to pay attention are past, particularly in terms of volunteer organizations. I think there's a lot of demand for lots of money. Certainly a competition for resources, and I think we have to demonstrate really good stewardship of money. So this is incredibly important. Next slide, please. I apologize for being on the soapbox. For my 2 years as president, I was nuts about budget stuff, right? We can go to the next slide, right? And then the overall score in the review is signature. Did this work? I can tell you that this worked amazingly well, amazingly well. What it meant when the R&D committee came to the board, they were prepared, they could answer questions, they had done the work. And what you learn, or I certainly have learned, that if a group gives a really good, well-prepared, thoughtful presentation, right, it goes pretty smoothly. Again, I think we have to be cautionary about the groupthink, but I do think that perhaps this ameliorates that from happening, so not necessarily a groupthink. I've watched the presentations and I just love watching what this group has done. All right, so the project gets approved. Now what? Who is it going to happen and where will the money come from? So I think we're done with the slides, yes? Right? All right, so I'm going to use our West Dallas project as an example. This was a community that had the second highest poverty rate in the country, and it was right under our very noses, and some of us began paying attention to this. And an interesting thing happened during the research for this project. As you may remember, I said that this was researched by an ad hoc group before this particular project, before we had put this process in place. So the section had decided it was time for a new project, and there were 5 projects that were seriously under contention. West Dallas was the one that was chosen. The initial undertaking in this neighborhood was a request by the West Dallas Multipurpose Center for a back-to-school fair, which we now see are happening all over the place and is totally in line with what NCJW National does. I've sat at back-to-school store meetings for a long time, impressed with what everybody manages to do. right? And this is small compared to any of those. They had done this the year before, and they had needed the addition of backpacks and binders for this fair, and it was going to be their second attempt. When we presented this, and this was totally within, we had adopted the neighborhood as a project, and this was going to be the first attempt as the neighborhood, and this was totally fine to be able to do this. So we present this to the board, and they say, well, there already is a mayor's back to school fair, right? So remember when we looked at one of the criteria pieces, when we don't need to go back to that, guys, we very clearly said, even if there is one, there may be room for another one. So that is a piece you need to figure out. And so our board, or some members of our board, suggested that why are we recreating the wheel? Why don't we join the mayor's back to school fair? So we head back to the West Dallas Multipurpose Center and say, let us help you get to the mayor's back to school fair. I mean, I just laugh at myself at this one. And Samantha heard the story, and she suggested I embarrass myself with this, so I will continue. And they responded, it would take our clients 2 buses and an hour to get back to the mayor's back to school fair. And we say, well, foolishly, we respond to them, well, maybe we should rent buses for you guys. And then their wonderful director at the Multipurpose Center says, why would you spend money like that? Holding a back to school fair here is about building our community. I don't know if you guys know the book, Knock on the Side of the Head, Bang in the Seat of the Pants. Anyway, this was my knock on the side of the head, right? I'm the one doing this, and asking all the questions and making the board recommendations, and my counterpart, an incredible woman, Janine Pullman, who was the volunteer director of Jewish Family Service here for many years, said, Renee, I know you know better. We need to listen to the community. The days of matriarchy are gone. And so we've got to learn to listen. And all things that I've seen at National, I know that that's exactly what our goal is to do. Not to walk in and tell a community what they need, but to listen to what the community is telling us that they need. So the leaders that were committed to this project wrote a grant proposal while simultaneously combining lists of people who they thought would be interested, and held parlor meetings to recruit volunteers. And I think we probably had 3 parlor meetings to tell the story of West Dallas. About 20 volunteers were on board to help organize, and the first year, on an August date, we distributed 500 backpacks and binders for back to school fair. Now, this is what was really amazing to me, was the amount of family participation. Our younger members jumped at this opportunity to come out on a Saturday and involve their kids. And it was nothing short of amazing as the kids lined up and helped distribute backpacks to other kids. It was a tear-jerking moment. I can tell you that we are still doing this. This was in 2016. It was this past Saturday, and it was a drive-by this Saturday. Nobody is getting out of their cars, right? So the director of this center, so this happens in August of 2016. So the director of this center says, you know, we need turkeys for our neighborhood. We need 250 turkeys. She'd managed to get donations of all the fixings. And quite frankly, we were really very skeptical about doing this. So again, families. So we did it on the Monday before Thanksgiving when kids were out of school, or the first day there were kids out of school. And again, it was amazing to see our families, our young families show up to help with the turkey distribution. The first year, Kroger donated it. The second year, we could not get a donation. And now it is a budget item for us as a section. Though there was one group, the Meadows Foundation, that they heard what we were doing and they really liked it. And now we're up to, this past year, we did 450 turkeys, right? So we were now giving out backpacks, and the goal always on this project was to grow the project. So we're giving out backpacks and giving out turkeys. And that December, Katie Nakama, the director of the center, says to us, you know, we've got kids and families that are really hurting at the holiday time, at this time. And so we went to our board of trustees and said there was an added request to what we had planned this year. And we gave out gift cards for 200 kids at Christmas time that year, Walmart gift cards, which is what the director had suggested that. Within a year, and part of what we had wanted to do was to help some of the schools in this neighborhood, in this West Dallas neighborhood. And Southern Methodist University, our local university, was very involved in this neighborhood. So we went to visit. Their School of Education was very involved with measuring outcomes, educational outcomes in this neighborhood. So we went to visit Regina Neipert, who is the director of the program of measuring school outcomes. And we said to her, we would love to get involved and help these schools. Tell me how we can do it. And Regina convened with the principals who totally trusted her. And we wound up adopting 5 schools. The need, DISD uses uniforms, and the need for uniforms was really incredible. Buying the uniforms was a burden for the family, and an added complication that we have learned along the way. And that complication was, this is a large immigrant population and probably significant undocumented people living in this neighborhood. So while the school district has money to be able to supplement families for uniforms, they have to fill out a form. And what we learned was the schools weren't getting forms back. They were very wary of filling out forms. And so while there was resources, we had to be prepared to trust the principals in the schools in this way and help them as we could. So we chose 5 of the neediest schools, right? Ones that were on breakfast, lunch, and after school programs. They sent the kids home with dinner, right? And the first year we provided uniforms for grades K through 2. Principals gave us everything that they needed. A friend owned a warehouse. The uniforms were sent to the warehouse, and volunteers sorted by school. I mean, there was stacks and stacks of boxes, and then volunteers on a given day distributed uniforms to the 5 schools. I think this year's figures are like 6,000 uniforms, guys. We also, during the year, principals contacted us. We had liaisons at all the schools. And we also provided underwear and socks, particularly for the little kids if they wet their pants. And so those were kept in the school nurses' offices. And in 2018, we created a clothes closet at the multipurpose center. So now we were in 5 schools as well as their community center, and made sure the community center had extra uniforms too. So we have a clothes closet that has met the needs. I'm thinking of this year's, about 625 families visited the clothes closet this year. We are now up to the, I just saw Ellen's note. Yeah, Ellen, you were one of the models. We are this year. So also we were tutoring in 2 of these schools. So one of our schools, one of our private schools, needed a service project, and we spoke to them, and we created something in one of the schools called the Giggly Girls Book Club, where 5th graders from the Hockaday School, there were about 20 of them, after school on a Thursday, and I often was one of the shuttle drivers. We would go from the Hockaday School to the Stevens Park Elementary School, and for 1 hour after school, the Hockaday girls would tutor identified kids, 2nd and 3rd graders from the Stevens Park Elementary School. Because they had a reading specialist who was really nothing short of amazing, Beatrice, they measured the kids before they started and at the end of the year when we finished the year. And there was an average of a 20% increase in the reading scores of the kids, of the Stevens Park kids. It was wonderful for the Stevens Park kids, but it was equally as wonderful for the Hockaday girls, who were always, you know, they said, can we bring treats? And so we would have to schlep treats with us. They were amazing with these girls. And so the impact was a double impact. We were growing community leaders, right? Beginning from the 5th grade, and we were making a difference in the reading scores in a very underprivileged neighborhood. There were, yes?
We got one great question in the chat as you're talking through this process, I think will be helpful to add is, for each of these additions to the project, did you go through the R&D submission and rubric process, or did you go through an evaluation and change process? And
we
how did
went through we did not, once the project is approved, we did not go back to R&D. Great question. But we have an evaluation rubric, and I'm watching my time, which you're going to see in less than 5 minutes, or actually much less than 5 minutes, right? The other phase in this neighborhood now is there are 12 adults teaching, tutoring 22 kids in a Martinez school. We carpool on 2 different ways during the week, and what I have learned along the way, and many of you can speak to this, I suspect, far better than I can, this is not our local neighborhood for most of our members. It's not so far away. It's a 20-minute drive. It's not a big deal. But it has been harder. You know, the one-shot deals, the giveaway of the backpacks and the turkeys, and that's not an issue, right? But the continuing involvement and going to the other end of town, right, is a building process. We keep adding and adding and adding. We were really excited because we were engaging. The goal had been to engage 20 kids in this school, and we had reached the goal of engaging, meaning tutoring 20 kids, right? Each tutor would see a child for 30 minutes. And again, the relationships that developed are nothing, you know, you walk out of tutoring and for these kids and you feel so good about yourself. It's unbelievable. All right. And March of 2020, everything comes to a halt. Right. All the tutoring stops and the interaction stops. Right. And Samantha and I have talked about it because there are many sections that are involved in tutoring. These kids really need the help, and we've got to figure that out because these kids were grade levels, several grade levels behind. We worked with kids. The SMU School of Education taught us that kids learn to read up until 3rd grade, and by 3rd grade, they read to learn. So if we don't get them at grade level by 3rd grade, they're going to struggle. And so now the struggle with all that's going on in the pandemic, the struggle is even more so, right? All right. Each year, to answer that question, each year this project is evaluated. And do we have the evaluation form, the PACE evaluation form, right? All right, so this is a PACE evaluation form. Every year there is a PACE committee formed, And usually about a dozen people are formed on the committee, and PACE is Public Affairs and Community Education is what PACE means. It's basically an evaluation committee. And here's what this committee is charged with doing. They have 12 members on the committee. They have to attend a 2-hour training session so they understand their role and what they do. We have lunch during the session. They do a site visit to the project and talk to some of the project volunteers. And they finally attend a 3-hour meeting to determine the allocations. Everybody, all of these 12 people have already received all the completed forms from the project leaders. And what you're looking at now is the project leader doing an evaluation of their project, right? And the budget committee meets before this process starts and decides how much money they're going to give to the PACE committee to be divided up amongst the chairs, and our budget committee does that work. So they meet and they work it out. So if you will scroll this, Lindsay, this is great. So back up 1 minute, Lindsay, I'm sorry. Right. So to answer some of your questions, how does the project deliver on the mission? What is the long-term vision for the project? What are the project's annual and 3 to 5 years goals? If you'd be nice enough to, how will you improve the lives of its participants, right? And this is the 2018-19, the form has not changed, right? How will you measure the outcomes, right? Describe the project, right? And notice for the schools, the liaison can communicate with the school principals, and we have done that and keep going, right? Right. Are there other similar projects in the community? This is not unlike the rubric that you've seen initially. So the process for our section is incredibly rigorous. It's incredibly rigorous. We do it before and we do it after. How do you know the community needs this project? Typically what we see is lots of documentation. Lindsay, if you'll scroll a little bit more. Right, leadership. So this is something really important. What is your leadership? What you're looking at is West Dallas. What is your and you guys have a blank one. I sent Samantha a blank one that she can include for you guys. What is your leadership succession plan? Right, because the goal is to get people trained to take over and involve more volunteers. What major changes? So there, some of you asked, right? So if they're going to change something or add something from year to year, this is how we see that. How do you raise awareness, right? The piece I told you I would love advice on. And the budget pieces, right? So we know, because this is the piece that helps us make the decision, right? Volunteers and any other, right? So if you'll scroll down to the end of that, Lindsay, that would be great. And again, how can we best support it? So every year, right? Every project that requests a budget goes through this process, right? So, which brings us to the sunsetting pieces, right? So how do you sunset a project? The evaluation form that you've just looked at is what we use, the PACE form, to sunset a project. There were 2 projects that we had to sunset. And as you can well imagine, sunsetting a project is a killer. It's really hard. So one was, and the Meyerson Symphony Center is a little more than 25 years old now, and NCJW, because there were so many of our members who were involved with the symphony, and so NCJW members became docents at the symphony, and it was a fabulous partnership. But the symphony had begun to train its own people and no longer needed NCJW volunteers, right? And so when we get to the PACE process, they would say, well, you know, we got maybe one phone call from Melanie, who was the person who was their liaison at the Symphony Center. And after 2 years of that, we made a very painful decision, right? And it was hard for some of the older members to let go of this project, but reality is they didn't need us anymore. And the second one that we just sunsetted this year was a group called Attitudes and Attire. An amazing group that really train women and train them and give them clothes to enable them to go back to work. So that volunteers would help them shop in that particular Attitudes and Attires closet, and then sort of coach them in job training skills. And the same was true for Attitudes and Attire. They had grown sufficiently where for 2 years in a row, our volunteers said, we haven't gotten any phone calls from them, right? And we had to sunset the project. It's hard, but when you have been helpful to an agency, we have to be able to smile and say, okay, they're doing well on their own. They'll come back to us if they need us again, but they don't need our volunteers anymore. And again, people's time is their most precious commodity. And so they could move on to something else. So that ends the formal piece of this presentation, right? And we have 10 minutes for questions, or Claire, if you want to close this and then go to questions, you guys make that decision.
Let's take a few minutes of questions and then see where we're at with time, and then maybe we'll close out, and those who want to stay on with more questions can do so.
Right.
So I'm going
All
to
right,
stop
Samantha,
this.
are you going to read the questions? In other words, so our mission to help women, children, and families, right? Does that fall? Is there, in what I will share with you, particularly about West Dallas, not only what is it the second highest poverty level, but it was the second highest in the country in pregnancy recidivism, right? So it totally fit with the fact that that community needed a lot of help, and that was part of the measure. And certainly we are advocating for teaching kids about sex education. And so that was something that was really a strong piece, and we were doing it already in that neighborhood. And we're partnering with 2 agencies, a group called Interrupt and Planned Parenthood, already in that neighborhood in terms of delivering services about sex education there. So that sort of fit with our advocacy piece. In other words, what we were asked, does it fit within our goals, right? Is this something that we're actively involved in, or are we going to be doing too much else in another way in advocacy and no time for this, right? So does that answer your question, Sue?
Yeah, thank you. And that ties right in. Thanks.
Okay, all right.
I have a question.
Sure.
I put up a reaction, a clap. I don't know how one raises a hand. So wonderful, wonderful programs. And this sort of ties in with the advocacy question a moment ago, but I'm thinking about advocacy in terms of legislative advocacy, whether it's at your local city council or state advocacy. The problems that you're helping to work with are problems of poverty, insufficient funding, hunger, insufficient school lunch programs, or whatever the case may be. So I'm wondering how and if you're tying in what you're doing on the ground and sort of working that with the actual legislative and policy advocacy.
So when we do Day on the Hill, we look at all the bills coming up, and of course we advocate, for spending on education. There is no question about that. That fits totally right in, and we do it. We, as you know, we go every other year locally. The off years from nationals, so we do that, and so education fits right into that. And we at a local and city level, particularly because we've been involved with the Dallas Independent School District, we have been talking and making sure that the kids, particularly in the schools that we tutored, what we've discovered, again, nothing new for Dallas, right? That not only do they not have resources, they didn't have computers, right? These kids are literally being turned out. They didn't have computers, and they didn't have internet connection in a great majority of their homes. So we've begun advocating for that and have shifted stuff around in our own budget to make sure the schools were involved and to see if they needed Chromebooks, how many kids were going to be without it. The city is now making a promise on hotspots for these kids. We discovered that in the April that families who could were driving to the libraries to pick up the signal for Wi-Fi in a parking lot. Again, these kids are falling so far behind. So strong, Claire, strong advocacy on that. And again, I have asked Samantha for help on this, because for those of us that are tutoring kids at NCJW, what are the ways that as NCJW, our conglomerate of all of our sections, help in this effort to these kids that are falling woefully behind? I think it'll be helpful for all of us, and Samantha is working on putting us together as a group. Yeah, the advocacy is so strong in this, Claire. Thank you for that.
Well, absolutely. Thank you.
And the RSVP link for that meeting is in the chat. It is next Monday at 4 p.m. Eastern time. We'll be having that conversation for any community service leaders or anyone who works on educational community service to come together and have that discussion and navigate challenges together. We received 2 more questions in the chat. One is, how do you adapt this process for smaller projects? And then I'll hold the one till after you answer this one.
All right. So my caution, which is why, was, okay, guys, so we are doing this for really big projects. And if you had which is why I asked if chat was being recorded, because the criteria that you all came up with when I asked the question is the pieces. You don't have to do it in such a formalized process that we chose to do. I think the criteria that you all came up with, and just look at the criteria and make it much less formal. You don't, right? You just have to learn to ask the right questions, guys. So in a smaller section for a smaller project, I think most of the same questions are valid, right? Regardless the size of the project. The budget may be smaller, but can you accomplish it? How many volunteers is it going to take? How long is it going to take? Do we have the right resources? What are we meeting the needs? I think however we do that, those questions are valid. Maybe not as complicated a process as we use, but certainly all those issues I think are valid for smaller projects, right?
So, but thank you. Samantha, before we move on to the next question, what I would like to offer is, because people have wonderfully set aside an hour of their time, and I want to make sure for them that we close the official part of the meeting. But if people, I understand that we can stay on for a few more minutes to continue asking and answering questions. But let me at least close down the official part of the meeting, if I may, so people who can't stay on feel okay about leaving. Is that all right?
Perfect.
So, okay, well, great. Well, for those of all of you that are on, I want to thank you so much for joining us to learn about project development. The recording of the webinar will be posted on our website and shared with the resources from today's training. Samantha, are you putting the poll up on the screen? Please take a moment to complete the poll, which will appear on your screen, about the webinar, because this feedback is really important to us to plan future trainings. And if you have any other feedback, please email Samantha at swile@ncjw.org. We're continuing to have these fantastic leadership programs. Our next one is going to be on Wednesday, August 19th at 5 o'clock Eastern Time. And that will address NCJW and National Voter Registration Day. Get out the vote to learn how to participate in National Voter Registration Day. Also, join us for our webinar, Tips and Tricks to Hosting a Zoom Webinar, on Monday, August 24th at 1:30 p.m. Eastern Time, to learn best practices for hosting these virtual events using Zoom webinars. Thank you, Renee, so much for sharing your expertise and the great practices developed by the Greater Dallas section. I know we're all smarter for that, and we're all leaving with some really great ideas about how to bring the inspiration, but also the rigor back to our sections and developing meaningful projects. Thank you.
Claire,
Yeah.
thank you. Before everybody signs off, because you mentioned the voter registration piece, because we are clearly involved in that. So when we last went to the West Dallas Multipurpose Center before we were shut down, we were working there. We registered voters there. So again, we now have a relationship in this neighborhood. So we said, let's ask the question. They said, sure, come in. And we set up a table during our turkey giveaways and and registered voters. So again, that relationship that develops is important.
Yeah, I love that. I love the intersection of our projects and our mission, right? So I think every opportunity when we can multiply our impact in different ways, we should ideally take advantage of it. So that's fantastic. Wonderful. So again, thank you everybody for joining us. Please stay well. We look forward to seeing you again soon. And those of you that would like to stay on a little longer to talk with Renee, please feel free to do so. Bye.
Thank you, Renee. That was really educational and obviously very professional. Thanks.
Oh, you're so welcome.
You can do our training anytime.
That's a very nice compliment. That goes into my piggy bank, right?
Right.
So Renee, one question we received in the chat before the closing remarks was, do you find it easier to provide services in a limited geographic area rather than developing a program that can go system-wide in your region?
So, all right, let me think. So if we developed, can this program, if this is the question, can be adapted to other communities and all over our state? I don't see why not, if that's the question. It's just a model. It's just a model. Just the way hippie is all over the place, you may want to give this another name. Yeah, I can't see why not. It'll be different in every place. But if that's the question, am I getting that right?
So the question, Renee, the question's from Ellen. Hi, Renee. So the reason I ask is we heard a community leader speak not too long ago, and they said the trend when developing new projects was to concentrate and focus on a region or a neighborhood or an area where you can do multiple different things in that region. Versus, okay, we're going to do backpacks and we're going to do them in 12 school districts. No, we're going to do backpacks in one school district and we're going to focus on the tutoring and we're going to focus on all the other pieces. And that what they're seeing nationally is more of a focus on working regionally, doing more in a smaller area, I guess is what I'm getting at. And that sounds like what you guys did here.
I could not agree with you more. Because it's like, again, I apologize for using some jargon, but it's systemic change. So that if we really want to make an impact, which was part of the decision for West Dallas, then because now we can go in and register voters there, right? We have a relationship, they trust us. We've done senior programs there in this center. There is an amazing senior program that one of our groups has gone in and done. I don't know if it was our Eating Well as a SNAP or Food, Fit, and Fun, but one of them, because of a relationship, was able to go in and work in the senior center there. This is also a center that is funded by the city. So the city now knows, right, that we are in, it's a city and a county use the same building at the West Dallas Multipurpose Center. So our goal is to make a difference in this particular community. Are there more? Of course there are. We all know that. But yeah, that was a decision. Thank you for that, Ellen. That was a clear decision to focus and go and look at this neighborhood. Right.
Are there any other questions? Great. Well, if anyone has another question, we can stay on for another couple minutes, or you can have a great rest of your day. Thanks again to Renee for leading such an excellent training. I hope you all gained many tools and new information, and thank you to Claire for taking the time to join us today, for the very welcoming introductory remarks and closing remarks. We really appreciate it.
All right, guys, the word now is stay safe, right? Right. For everybody in California and in Florida and Dallas, right, Texas, where our numbers are going up one more time. So, so guys.
Be well.